Hey there, everybody. There have been a lot of goings on for me over the last couple of weeks. Most of them are really quite nice. I've been really enjoying them. A lot of them are, well, on the global stage, not great. So I decided, you know what, I need to step up, and since I've been having trouble making a time before I go to bed, we're just going to do this earlier in the evening. So we're continuing the Legend of Huma, chapter 15. The great giants loomed over them, oblivious to the tiny, uneasy creatures at the outermost edge. The mountains had been magnificent from a distance. They were overwhelming up close. Not even Magius spoke. As one, they could only stare. The mountains here were old, much older than many of their counterparts to the east and even to the north. More than one peak vanished into the cloud cover, testimony to unbelievable heights. Time had weathered all the mountains some so much that they resembled the shells of gigantic sea creatures. The wind, ever present and 10 times wilder than that on the plains, filled the air with almost human shrieks as it danced through the chain. Sargus, whispered Kaz, and nobody reprimanded him for the quiet exclamation. It was, of course, Magius who broke their concentration. He shifted uneasily on his mount, his gaze fixed, for the most part, on the peaks within the heart of the chain. We will accomplish nothing sitting here gaping. Are you prepared to go on, Huma? Huma blinked. Yes, I guess we might as well. Kaz? The Minotaur gazed up at the peaks and finally smiled. I am quite familiar with such a landscape, my friend. I have no qualms. We will wait here for you for 3 days, just as a precaution, Boron said. Magius sniffed and looked disdainfully away. It is not necessary. Nevertheless, we will. What you say matters not. Well, let us go then, Huma quickly put in. He had a great desire to get this over and done with, if that were possible. Agreed, Magius urged his horse forward. Huma, Boron said somberly and held out a hand. His face was much like the mountains before them, hard-featured but still admirable in its own way. May Paladin watch over you. And you as well. The other knights nodded their farewells as Huma passed. Huma did not look back as he rode, afraid that the desire to turn back from what might well be a foolish quest would ensnare him. Yet he showed no sign of fear to Magius or Kaz. A knight such as Bennett would have ridden into the mountains prepared to face the Dragon Queen herself, if need be. Huma knew that he could never do that, but he would do his best to ride with dignity. All too soon they entered the mountain range. The peaks stood all around them, fantastic walls and barriers that seemed ready, waiting, to close in and wipe out all trace of the tiny creatures who had dared to infest them. Mountains such as these have always made me realize how an insect must feel, Kaz commented. Ahead of them, Magius laughed scornfully. These are mere lumps of rock, impressive at first, but no more deserving of such reverence than the tiniest pebble on the beach. You have never truly known mountains, then. Be careful, lest they bury you beneath their insignificance. A cry rose from somewhere within the range of mountains. It was a harsh, predatory cry, and all three riders glanced around quickly. As the seconds passed and nothing materialized, Kaz turned to Magius. What was that? Are you familiar with the sound? The mage had regained his composure as well as his arrogance. A bird, perhaps. Possibly even a dragon. It would not surprise me to discover that the latter live here. Here? Huma had sudden visions of great red dragons swooping down on the hapless group. Magius might be able to hold them off temporarily, but neither Kaz nor Huma would have much of a chance. A broadsword was of little use against the armored hide of a dragon. The trail was a twisting series of slopes, ledges, and precarious turns. Boron had said that dwarves, long since departed from this region, had created the path, the only one that granted travelers some hope of emerging on the opposite side. The knights traveled the mountains as little as possible, not because they were afraid, but because they knew that even the few brigands of the region steered clear of the chain. The wind whipped Huma's cloak wildly around, and he was forced at last to pin it around him. The chill wind created eerie sounds like the calling of strange, unimaginable beasts. Magius still had the lead, since he was the only one with any real idea of where he was going. Huma was searching for a peak that matched the one of the tapestry, while Kaz was content merely to ride and let the others do the work. He cared little about what the magic user was searching for. His own health, and Huma's, was all that truly mattered. The red robe could perish for all that Kaz cared. They rode round yet another turn and came to a dead stop. Magius sputtered curses. Kaz laughed despite the sinister look in the spellcaster's eyes. The path lay buried beneath tons of rubble. Huma looked up and saw a new crevice in the side of one of the mountains. He tried to imagine the power required to create such a landslide. "I'll not be cheated!" Magius stood in the saddle, crying out at the mountains. He whirled on the other two and said, "There were two diverging paths a short distance behind us. See if either curls around back towards this one. I'll see if there is anything that can be done here." The Minotaur did not care to take orders from Magius, but Huma quieted him. It would not do for Kaz to cross the mage now. While the spellcaster investigated the avalanche, Huma and Kaz rode back. The paths that Magius had spoken about seemed fairly unused, and one had even been obscured by the fragile shrubbery prevalent in the mountain chain. Huma chose the overgrown trail. Kaz broke off to investigate the other path. Huma watched him disappear, then he climbed off his horse. The footing on the path was too tricky, and he had no desire to endanger himself and his horse. Better to leave the animal behind. If the path had proved steadier ahead, he would return for the horse and investigate further. It required the use of his broadsword to clear the path of foliage. Although the individual plants were weak, they grew in such profusion that it was like cutting into thick bales of hay. Huma was forced to chop continuously for several minutes before he made progress. First glance indicated that the path continued a rocky upwards climb that made riding impossible and walking a slow, dragging tedium. Suddenly, he stepped onto a gentle downward slope partly hidden by the vegetation. Huma smiled in relief. His path seemed to circle around to meet up with the original path beyond the avalanche. After a lengthy inspection, he finally concluded that the path was not only passable, but that it would lead them more directly to the peaks Magius sought. It was also, he was pleased to note, a much less wind-blown path. The knight turned back, increasing his pace. By this time, he was sure that Kaz had completed his own search. He doubted also that Magius would have found a way around the avalanche in the meantime. Huma's path looked to be the best, and perhaps the only choice. He came to the meeting of the two slopes and stumbled back onto the rocky part of the trail. Huma turned a corner and stopped, dead, before a great wall of rock. "What?" he muttered, his brow raised in wonder. He looked up the length of the formation and laid a hand on its surface. It was all too real. He had to have taken a wrong turn, he realized. Huma backtracked and stood in puzzlement. Every indication was that he had followed the correct path the first time. The legend of Pupper who does not care about her poor, dear-old cold dad. She's going to keep knocking on the curtains until I let her out. So, let me get a jacket.
I'm not sitting on the balcony with you, goof.
It's cold out there. She was sitting in the bedroom, staring at me, going, "Dad, I want to be outside, but I want the bedroom to be outside." Unfortunately, Pupper, it doesn't work like that. Huma backtracked and stood in puzzlement. Every indication was that he had followed the correct path the first time, yet the rock formation looked as though it had been in place for years. Moss dotted its surface. The formation was quite weathered, almost round on top. Finally, Huma gave up and returned to the other intersection that he had discovered. Despite the feeling that this was the wrong route, he began to follow it. As he progressed, his confidence rose, for the trail seemed to lead back to where he wished to be. Then, it abruptly curved towards the opposite direction. Soon Huma was following a trail of twists and turns that kept his head spinning. The night came to a halt. This path was leading him farther away. He grumbled to himself and then turned around to retrace his trail. The path he'd traveled, which he knew should have twisted to the right, now twisted to the left. This was all wrong. Huma knew he could have made a mistake before, but not this time. He'd been especially cautious, painstakingly noting the way. Boron and others had said many travelers never left these mountains. Now, he could see why. It was as if the mountains themselves moved against the unwary, although Huma knew it must really be the work of a mortal entity. His thoughts returned to Galen Dracos. But this did not seem to fit the renegade's style. He was being herded, he realized. Dracos would have captured him by now. No, this was magic with another purpose. His sword unsheathed, Huma began following the only available path. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just rocks, scraggly bushes, and a high-flying bird now and then. The path suddenly split off in two directions. Huma paused, suspecting that he really had only one choice, but which? He pondered for some time before he noticed the tap-tap beat coming from behind him. Huma whirled his blade up and ready. He had been expecting an ogre or perhaps one of the Black Guard. Instead, he found himself facing a hooded figure sitting on a large, flat rock. The tap-tap came from a staff, much like Magius's, and it was held by a gray, gloved hand, partially covered by the sleeve of a cloak. The gray cloak, in turn, covered most of the form of a... Huma stepped closer to be sure. Gray-faced man? The gray man stroked his long gray beard and smiled almost imperceptibly at the knight. Huma lowered the blade, but not all the way. "Who are you?" he asked. "Who are you?" the gray man rejoined. The knight frowned a bit, but decided to play the game for now. "I am Huma, Knight of the Order of the Crown." "Ah, Knight of Solamnia," the dull-colored figure spoke as if he had known it all along. The staff went tap-tap. "I've answered your question, now answer mine." "I?" the gray man smiled, revealing gray teeth. "I am merely a fellow traveler." Huma indicated the area around them. "This is not your doing?" "The mountains? Oh, no, they've been here for a long time, I understand." "I meant the paths that vanish." The other's eccentric attitude irritated Huma. "I do not move mountains. It is quite possible that you are just not seeing well enough with your eyes." The figure on the rock blended perfectly into the background. Huma found that to look away even for a moment meant he had to look carefully to find the man again. No doubt the gray man had been sitting on the rock when Huma came through moments earlier. The knight had never even seen him. "Are you a magic user?" Huma queried. The tap-tap of the staff ceased for a moment. "Now that is an interesting question." And the tapping resumed. "Well," Huma was fighting for control. The gray man seemed to think for a moment. Then he pointed the staff towards the two paths behind Huma and asked, "Were you not choosing a path? You should get on with it, you know. You might be going somewhere important." "Very well. Which one would you choose?" Huma held his breath, wondering if he was going to receive an answer that made some sense. After further consultation with himself, the slate-colored man pointed the staff at the path to the left. "That one has proven to be quite popular." "Thank you." Huma stalked off towards the chosen path. He wanted nothing more to do with the gray man and paths that came and went. The sooner he was away. "Of course," the odd figure added, "others have found the right path to be the right path." Huma stopped. He turned and stared coldly at the gray man. "Well, which would you choose?" "I'm not going anywhere." "For a Jedi, the time to eat is well." The knight studied the two paths. From where he stood, they looked identical. He could not make a choice based on appearances. He would have to go with his instincts. Purposefully, Huma stepped over to the trail on the right and began walking. He did not look back even when the familiar tap-tap picked up again. The parting comment, though, did cause him to pause momentarily. An interesting choice. The tapping ceased. Huma, despite himself, turned around. The path and the gray man had disappeared. In their place stood a tall, angling peak. Huma trudged along the winding trail for hours. He noted that the sun was already low in the sky, which meant that he had been separated from the others for a good part of the day. Calling out had proved futile. The wind had picked up. Huma drew his cloak round him, daring to sheathe his sword so he could pull the garment tighter. He wondered how cold it would get in these mountains, and then decided it would be best not to think about it. Where were Magius and Kaz? He hoped the Minotaur and the magic user would not kill one another now that Huma was not there to keep both under rein. His stomach stirred in hunger again, prompting a vague twinge of guilt. Fasting was a rite of purification for the knighthood. A few hours should not have affected him. A few berries dotted the bushes he passed, but previous experiments had proved them to be inedible and possibly even poisonous. He had seen no sign of animal life and had heard none, save for the occasional cry of whatever creature waited out there. A great bird, perhaps. What did it eat, then? Unwary and foolish travelers? Evening finally fell, and Huma waited for a sign from Magius. Neither light nor sound came through the darkness, however. Huma was still on his own when night had grown to maturity. The night was bright for a change. Somehow, the stars always seemed to shine through the cloud cover where the sun could not. Perhaps most encouraging, Solinari was at last ascendant. The god of the white robes now watched over the world, and although Magius wore the robes of crimson, Huma hoped that Solinari would watch over his friend as well. Huma finally paused for the night, tired and confused, determined to go on once morning came. He crawled under an overhang in a fairly level spot and wrapped his cloak round him. A fire was out of the question. Huma had survived worse, but hunger pangs continued to irritate him, even as he drifted away into sleep. Huma stirred. A sound like the flapping of mighty wings had pulled him from his slumber. Peering from his shelter, he saw nothing but the night and decided it was only a rockfall or the wind. He was soon back to sleep. From behind a far outcropping, two gleaming blood-red eyes peered sightlessly at the unsuspecting figure. The Dreadwolf was set to watch only, not kill, not this time. Yet the slumbering human made a satisfactory target, and the abomination began to slink forward, yellowed teeth bared. It readied itself to leap, and a monstrous claw slashed out and crushed it beyond the undead thing's ability to regenerate. Not a sound broke the night's stillness. Huma stirred again, but did not awaken. The dawn brought with it the feeling that he was not alone. Huma scanned the surrounding area. All remained as it had been the day before, save that the weather had grown a little warmer. Hunger still touched him, but he was beginning to gain control over it, or perhaps he had passed that point when it mattered. He dared call out to his companions. The wind was weaker, and Huma thought that this time he might be heard. If that meant facing the creature that cried out yesterday, so be it. There was no response to his shouts, either from the mage. I don't like how that's written. Neither from the mage, nor Minotaur, nor from the nameless creature. Huma gave up shouting and renewed his walk down the odd path. He no longer cared whether he would even retrace his steps. To his surprise and pleasure, the trail became smoother and simpler to follow. And food was available, berries from a new type of bush. When they proved to be palatable, he began devouring all that he could find. Of course, any poison might be slow in acting, but Huma recognized these plants. He decided that whatever had created the path wanted him alive, for the time being.
Hi, sweetness. Did you find this geeky thing? No, did you not eat the thing? No. 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 Alright. In. You are going to
to make yourself sick by eating things that are not good for Pupper. Guess who found and started snacking on a disembodied bird leg? Gross. Now I have to wash my hands. Gross. How long that was. I don't know how long that was there, and now I'm using a Clorox wipe as a hand wipe because that was really gross. You are a stinky baby. I love you very much, but you are stinky. Your attitude is stinky. I still love you. I still love you. You are a stink. I love you. At last, when he began to believe the path would go on forever, the trail stopped before a shining pool of water surrounded by fruit-bearing trees and a garden. Thirsty, he hurried to the edge of the pool. The water could not be poisonous if such life surrounded it, and Huma leaned down and scooped up a handful. The moisture trickled down his chin as he drank. Not satisfied with that, he knelt and bent forward to sip from the pool itself. A dragon's face stared up from the water. He jumped away from the water's edge and realized that the dragon's face had been a reflection. He looked up with rapidly widening eyes. Huma had reached his destination. A great stone dragon 6 times his size flanked the pool, and Huma saw that it had once had a counterpart on the opposite end. Only the pedestal and part of the head remained of the second dragon. Both appeared to have been carved out of marble or some similar stone. The one still standing appeared to be a silver dragon, while the fragmented one had been a gold dragon. Huma drank his fill. When he was finished, he looked straight ahead and noticed a doorway hidden by a tangle of plant life and literally cut into the mountain itself. He moved closer and studied the doorway. Tiny figures had been carved in relief around the opening, some of them weathered away, some, protected by the heavy covering of plant growth, perhaps, were still quite recognizable, at least as definite shapes. Huma wished desperately to know what the symbols might mean. Pushing aside thick vines, he peered inside. It should have been dark inside, yet he could see a faint glow within, almost as if someone had lit torches to guide his way. He thought uneasily. Sighing in resignation, he stepped into the entrance of the mountain, expecting the cave-like entryway to be damp and moldy. Instead, it was as if he had stepped into the council chamber of Vingard Keep. The entrance was warm and dry, the walls and ceiling were smooth. It took him some time to travel the length of the stark hallway, his attention concentrated on the flickering light ahead. He completed the final stretch of the corridor. Belatedly, he remembered his sword and removed the weapon from its sheath. The corridor opened into a great hall, once the court of some great king or emperor, Huma decided. It stretched high. It was a natural cavern carved to perfection. The light was indeed from torches, and Huma wondered who had lit them. Metallic statues of armored knights lined each wall. They were lifeless and very lifelike. They could almost be sentries commanded to sleep until needed, or the undead ordered to slay any who intruded. Huma stepped into the center of the room and stared at the floor. Now he could see the pattern etched into the stone. It, above all else, gave him heart, for it was a huge representation of Paladin himself, the Platinum Dragon. The dragon curled from one end of the room to the other, and, if the knight was any judge, The pattern was indeed made of platinum. Huma marveled over the intricate work. His gaze roved to the single piece of furniture in this cavern, a high throne carved from wood such as Huma had never seen, wood that seemed to glow with life. The edges of the throne were encrusted with jewels, and these, too, gleamed from the light of the torches. Childlike wonder swept over him as he walked around the chamber. The armor, he noted, included many of the various types worn by the knighthood over the ages. He opened more than one visor and peered inside, finding nothing but dust. At last, he simply stood and gave thanks to Paladin for allowing him to proceed this far. He also prayed that the triumvirate would watch over his two companions, despite their differences. Then he knelt in reverence before the throne. His vigil, though, was interrupted almost before it began. A pounding sound, as from metal upon metal, resounded from one of the darkened corridors. Huma came to his feet and peered round, trying to discern from which of the corridors the sound originated. The pounding died even as he stood, and Huma was unable to fathom its direction. Huma remembered where he had heard sounds like that before, back at Vingard Keep. It was the sound of a very heavy hammer. It was the sound that a very heavy hammer made when beating hot metal into shape at a forge. Chapter 16. A forge. Huma wondered what that might mean. He had expected any number of things here, but not an active smithy. For that matter, who held that hammer? Ghosts of ages past? Perhaps the dwarves had not left this place after all. His eyes turned back towards the throne, and he discovered that he was no longer alone. Huma's first thought was that the gray man had returned, for the robe and the hood, which covered all identity, were indeed dun-colored. But this new visitor was much more slight. "You've come." Her voice was low, and the cloak almost muffled it, but it was indeed a female voice. Small, feminine hands emerged from the billowing sleeves of the cloak, and the woman reached up to take hold of the hood. Slowly she pulled it back, revealing long, thick, flowing hair, and a face that both thrilled and shocked the knight, for he had known it and longed for it. "Gwyneth!" She smiled. "I thought that you had perhaps forgotten me." "Never." The smile widened, then vanished abruptly. "I knew it would be you when I first laid eyes on you in the... lying there, battling a mind-killing wound. Yes, your wound was far worse than you know. No bones had been broken, but your mind... Had not the healers taken care of you as quickly as they did, you would have lost all senses permanently." "Paladin," he breathed, "to be struck deaf, dumb, and blind, or worse." "Gwyneth, what is this place?" "Call it a gift of love. It was built by those with great love for Paladin and his house. They wanted nothing in return. It was magnificent in its day." She had a disconcerting way of talking as if she had actually been there in the past, Huma thought. "Is this what Magus sought?" "In a sense. Your friend is still a good man, Huma, despite his obsession. It may still consume him. Whether he believes it or not, the future he faced during the test was nothing more than an intricate fabrication. The tests are designed to highlight one's greatest weakness, and I fear that he did not pass as easily as the Conclave had hoped." And all of this looking had nothing to do with what he said. Gwyneth looked surprised. "Oh, but it does. The idea of this place has been passed on to man for centuries, ever since the first war with the Dragon Queen. It has not changed much. The Conclave knew the ego of their student Magius. The greatest fault of your childhood companion is that, like the elves, he sees himself as the power to save the world. What better way of testing him than to make him fail at the greatest of all tasks?" Huma was silent as his mind digested this. Finally he asked, "And what of me?" Magius seemed to think that I was important to changing his future. "You are important, but not in the way he thinks. What has been sought for so long is a single man or woman who embodies all that Paladin has attempted to teach this world. Some have come close, but all have failed in the end."
Bush. Bush.
As his eyes widened, she nodded sadly. You are not the first to come here, Huma. I pray, oh Paladin, I pray, that you are the one sought. Were it not Kryn itself that would suffer, I would tell you to turn from here now, before it is too late. The knight stiffened. Even if you told me to, I would not, I cannot, not and remain what I am. Is the knighthood so much to you? Not the knighthood, what it teaches. He'd never thought of it in those terms before. Gwyneth looked pleased, but merely said, if only there were others like you, even in the knighthood. Gwyneth, where are Kaz and Magius? They will be watched, have no fear, Huma. She paused. It is time to start, I think. Start? Huma looked round, half expecting the room to fill with clerics and mages ready to perform some ceremony. Instead, Gwyneth stepped down from the throne and moved towards him, although dressed simply and without expression on her face. She looked more beautiful than he had ever thought possible. Boron's nymph paled in comparison. She wavered only momentarily under his gaze. Huma tried fruitlessly to understand what was revealed in that lapse. When Gwyneth was no more than an arm's length from him, she pointed at the darkened corridors. You may choose whichever one you wish. What happens then? You walk it. What happens next is up to you. I can only tell you that you must face 3 challenges. It is said that each member of the triumvirate created part of the challenges, although no challenge represents one god, just as a man is the sum of his parts, not separate qualities that exist independently of one another. Huma studied each of the corridors for a long time. If he was to proceed, he would have to trust in Paladin and hope to make the right choice. He took a step towards his choice, but Gwyneth caught his arm. Wait. She kissed him lightly. May Paladin watch over you. I do not want you to fail. He could think of nothing adequate to say, so Huma quickly turned away and moved towards the corridor that he had chosen. He knew that if he looked back and she was still there, he might be tempted to stay. He also knew that if he stayed, he would never be able to live with himself. So, as a quick aside, that line was, if I cannot turn away and remain what I am. That is one of the reasons why I like Captain Pike so much in when he's introduced in Star Trek Discovery, is when he sees the future. I don't think that seeing the future binds him to it. It's understanding that he can turn away from it, but only by denying who he is and dealing with the consequences of it. And I think that makes it a lot more powerful and a lot more interesting for his character. Anyway, sorry. So he could think of nothing adequate to say, so Huma quickly turned away and moved towards the corridor that he had chosen. He knew that if he looked back and she was still there, he might be tempted to stay. He also knew that if he stayed, he would never be able to live with himself. The corridor he picked was like a natural cave. In spots, the passage constricted, forcing him to duck or move sideways. It was also very, very long and nearly plunged in darkness. Soon, the passage began to glow with a light of its own, a light that came from the very walls. Huma paused to study this phenomenon. Do. He had heard tales of this sort of light. The wall's glow gave Huma an idea. He knocked a piece of rock loose with the hilt of his sword and put it, still glowing, into his belt pouch. An ear-splitting, earth-shaking cry tossed him to the ground. Rock fragments covered him. It was the same cry that Huma had heard in the past. He now knew its source. Straight ahead. And straight ahead was the only way left to Huma, for, as the trail had done, the corridor behind him revealed nothing but a stone wall. Sword and shield ready, he crept down the tunnel towards the sound. He stepped from that corridor into yet another. This broke off into 3 directions, any of which the thing might occupy. Huma straightened in nervous annoyance. The cry was echoing through the cavern system. The creature might be anywhere. It might be hours away in some deeper chamber. It might even be right behind him. That thought on his mind, he shifted his feet and did not meet solid ground. With a metal rattling clang, Huma went down. Huma cleared his head with a shake and looked at the thin pool of dark liquid that had made him slip. He put a finger in it and brought the sample closer to study it better. For such a small puddle, it stank terribly. To his horror, Huma noticed the substance was eating into the metal of his glove. He wiped the foul stuff off on the rock, which seemed even much more resistant to the liquid. It seemed like laughter. Evil laughter at first. Huma clambered to his feet, but he could still not tell from which of the 3 tunnels the noise had come. And as it repeated, he knew the sound was not laughter. It was breathing. Something incredibly large, unless the chamber's amplified sound, lurked nearby. While it might prove safer to remain anchored in this one location, Huma had no desire to do so. He chose the center corridor and hurried down it. Physically, it was identical to the last one. Huma wondered how such an obviously large creature could make its way through some of these narrow confines. Even Huma had his difficulties. This tunnel led him to another tunnel, which looked exactly like the 2 before it. The caverns made up a maze, with Huma as both contestant and prize in some subterranean game of peril. As he walked, he noticed the dark liquid that flowed under his feet and the heat that emanated from several corridors. There was a sulphurous smell to the heat, which Huma believed pointed to a conduit to the mountain's fiery heart. Huma had heard of mountains such as this, and prayed that this one would not erupt while he was within it. Huma flattened himself around a corner. Echo or not, he knew now that he and the other were mere minutes apart. The other also apparently knew, for he chuckled madly, most definitely madly. When the laughter died, the other spoke in slow, deep tones. "Manling. I smell you, Manling. I smell the warmth of your body, the bitter chill of your metal armor. I smell your fears." Huma said nothing, but he fell back silently to the corridor from which he had entered. He did not want to face something as large as this tunnel dweller unless he could find a place where he could maneuver. "Come to the worm, Father Manling. Let me show you my strength." Wormfather's hearing was obviously quite extraordinary, for the beast hissed loudly whenever Huma moved, and then I could hear the scraping of a large form against the sides of the tunnel. Huma moved down an open corridor, circling Wormfather, he hoped. The hissing seemed to come from all around him. The corridors appeared endless. The hissing abruptly halted, and Huma froze. There was silence for several minutes, save for the maddening beat of the knight's heart. Then the scraping sound echoed again as the Wormfather seemed to move away from Huma. He realized that the relative smoothness of the tunnel walls was the result of continual wearing away by the body of his pursuer. The coarse scraping sound died away while Huma pondered. Quietly, he made his way farther along the tunnel. If he could only find his way out of this maze. Wild laughter, and the passageway exploded into flame. Huma had no choice now but to run. The Wormfather knew where he was. Huma abandoned stealth and simply fled the direction of the nearest corridor. Another burst of fire sent him scurrying out of that passage. How could Wormfather move so swiftly? What was Wormfather? He would not count how many passageways he ran through, nor how many times the laughter of the tunnel dweller warned him just before more searing flame licked at his mustache. Running frantically, Huma did not at first notice the wide opening to his left. It was not until he had passed it that the knight realized that he had come across something other than a corridor. Huma came to an immediate halt and froze. The malevolent hiss of Wormfather was far away for the moment, although Huma knew that could easily change at any second. Cautiously, the knight edged back to the side passage. and then leaned forward enough that he could peer into it. It was a very short corridor ending in what appeared to be more of a cavern. Huma stepped around into the new passageway and walked slowly down it. The cavern loomed large. It appeared to have been honed much in the same way as the corridors, by the constant wear of some huge form against the rock itself. But where was the Leviathan itself? Where was Wormfather? Huma glanced around the cavern. Tunnel entrances dotted it from various levels. The knight's sharp gaze followed the contours of the floor. It was smooth enough to walk on, although the slopes became steep in a few places, especially where it suddenly rose. Huma mentally cursed his predicament and stepped back into the corridor. What he had seen, what he wished desperately to deny, was a massive, serpent-like form that rose through the bottom of the cavern like some cursed tree and turned abruptly to the side, continuing on through one of the farther tunnels. Here, at last, he beheld a portion of the Wormfather. The malevolent creature pulsated with life as it stretched from that gaping chasm in the center. All that was visible was a trunk whose reptilian diameter was twice Huma's height. Its otherwise dull gray body was covered in splotches of green and blue as if it were infected. The trunk suddenly descended into the chasm. The terrible head of Wormfather emerged from another passage, shocking Huma with a startling revelation. Wormfather was a dragon. The Leviathan dwarfed all the dragons that Huma had ever seen or heard of. Wormfather's maw could easily have snapped up a team of horses in 2 bites, a single man in much less. The long, wide teeth stretched nearly as high as Huma, and the sinewy, forked tongue that flickered in and out of Wormfather's jaws could easily envelop him. The smell of sulfur was everywhere, and Huma realized that the mountain peak did not have an active heart. The dragon caused the smell. Huma froze as the ponderous head of the dragon turned his way. There was something odd about the head. It seemed larger in proportion to the thickness of the neck, which in turn was far too long for any dragon that Huma could recall. Recognition made the knight gasp. Wormfather was the dragon after which the statuette in Magius' citadel had been patterned. Yet the statuette had to have been ancient, even by elven standards. Could any dragon live that long? Wormfather hissed. Its head turned so that it could not possibly have missed the knight. Yet the deadly beast continued to scan the cavern. It was only when Huma looked at the eyes that he knew why. A whitish film covered each. Wormfather was blind. The creature was not deaf, though, and most certainly had a keen sense of smell. It had passed up the night once. Huma doubted it would do so again. Even now, the lengthy snout seemed to be investigating some of the areas that it had already passed. Unless Wormfather poked its head back into one of the corridors, the dragon would find Huma momentarily. As if thinking the same thoughts, Wormfather spoke. The creature's words made the immense chamber tremble. "A tricky one. I am pleased. It has been so long since I had even the slightest challenge. The others were so easy." The head swung near Huma. Gaping nostrils flared as the mighty dragon sniffed for the scent of the night. "I smell the taint of Paladin on you, of Habakkuk, of the most cursed of all the gods of the light, my jailer, the damned Kiri Jolith." Huma did not move, did not breathe during this outburst. The Leviathan had spoken of an encounter with at least one of the gods responsible for the creation of the knighthood, an encounter that had left the dragon quite the worse off, if it seemed. "Are you here for my treasure? It is the greatest hoard that any dragon could ever gather. Even trapped as I am, I have ways of gathering it. Ah!" The massive jaws bent to a macabre reptilian grin. "Perhaps it is the mirror you seek. Yes, the mirror would be worth all else that I have." All the while it spoke, Wormfather sniffed round the cavernous chamber, seeking out Huma. A sound of metal striking metal rang through the chamber. Huma reacted instinctively, covering his ears as the noise pounded at his mind. It was the forge again, the hammer at the forge. If the hammering disturbed Huma, it enraged Wormfather to madness. The dragon added to the noise with shrieks of its own. Curses, crying, threats, all manner of words rushed from its mouth. Froth dripped from its maw. "My queen, why do you let them torment me? Have I not endured countless millennia gone to dust? Must I suffer yet more of the ceaseless hammering and hammering of that cursed smith? Have you forsaken me, great Tachesis?" Across the chamber, a corridor glowed brighter than the others. Wormfather had spoken of his hoard, and now, even here, it had been able to seek out treasure. Might there not be something of use in such a hoard? A weapon, perhaps, more deadly than Huma's own seemingly insignificant sword. It was, to be sure, a desperate measure. Even as the beast renewed its shouts, Huma was running. The clatter of his boots on the rocky floor alerted Wormfather, but the hammering prevented the dragon from pinpointing the tiny human figure. In anger, the dragon roared and unleashed random bursts of searing flame. Huma dove into the corridor. The dragon had mentioned a mirror of some great importance. Huma remembered the mirror of the nymph, the one side that she had used to gaze at the dreams of others. Might they be related? Hers, though, had only been a way of capturing others' dreams. This one had other properties, perhaps. Still, Wormfather ranted and raved at the sound of the hammer. Huma made his way down the corridor, fearing that he had erred. All he might find were gold and jewels, useless at the moment. There might be nothing. Huma fell, and his eyes caught a horrible, momentary glimpse of what he had tripped over. A battered skull grinned at him, while a disjointed arm pointed at him in mockery. The crumbled remains of armor wrapped much of the body's frame. Huma succeeded in rolling with the fall, though the collision unsettled him. Huma stood and stared sadly at the partial skeleton. It was very old, and the armor was nearly all rust. There were some visible markings, though, and Huma, in horrid fascination, wiped dust from the breastplate and beheld the insignia of a Knight of the Rose. A prayer instinctively jumped to his lips. Here was a knight who had made it this far only to perish. Only to perish, as Huma might. Even as the thought came unbidden, he realized the new danger. The hammering had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Huma took a few steps forward, almost without realizing it, and nearly stumbled onto an immense pile of valuables. There were coins aplenty, gold and silver, more than Huma had ever seen. They glittered, almost entrancing him. Mixed in with them was a variety of rare items, many bejeweled, all of them fascinating. Necklaces of large, perfect pearls, small figurines of some crystalline design, perhaps formed of emeralds or jade. Armor that might have been forged only yesterday, some so elaborate that it must have been created for mighty emperors who could afford the craftsmanship, the extravagant decorations. There were even weapons, although most were useless, having been designed more for style and expense than for use. He quickly surveyed the room, his heart racing. All this before him, when he would have gladly traded it in for a single weapon capable of defeating the huge cavern dweller.
"Where have you run, manling?"
Huma stiffened. The Wormfather was very close by. Any second the corridor might become filled with flame.
"The smith has abandoned you, Knight of Salamnia. Yes, I know you now. I can smell the taint of the three in you, stronger than ever before. You are a Knight of Salamnia, a true believer, unlike those before. They thought they believed, but they only pretended. You, though, you are different. I wonder what you will taste like."
Rusted battle axes, jeweled swords fit only for ceremony. This could not be the vast hoard the dragon had spoken about, unless in its madness Wormfather had dreamt up its treasures. The mirror, too.
"I have you now!"
Huma could hear the slithering and scraping as the massive head wormed its way into the corridor. He whirled and realized that the relatively meager hoard of gold and jewels was only the overflow from another chamber. He reached into the uppermost part of the mound of valuables and began digging. Sure enough, within a few seconds, the digging revealed an opening. It was only a small opening so far, and it grew slowly as he continued to labor, each second expecting to feel the blistering heat of the Wormfather's breath on his back. The effort was tiring. The continuous wedge of his valuables made an effective blockade. Huma cursed silently as more coins and odd artifacts flowed to replace those he had removed. The knight took a deep breath. Digging was not good enough. As he cleared a tangle of jewels from the gap, he began crawling forwards like a mole. He had already burrowed deep into the pile when he felt the hot, fetid breath of the dragon. Wormfather could not use its flame here lest it destroy its own treasure. Thus, the dragon was twisting its head and neck all the way to the entrance to the chamber of treasures. The Leviathan's head came around the corner, just in time to hear the knight vanish into the other chamber. Wormfather paused. After a moment, the huge reptilian lips curved into a malevolent smile, and the great dragon began the process of removing itself from the chamber. All was dark at first, strange after so many corridors filled with their own light. Huma wondered why this one was so different. Unable to see, he crawled awkwardly through the immense collection of treasures. Here must certainly be the main hoard, but how was he to find anything in the dark? Was there anything to find? Somehow, he felt there must be. If this was a test, there must be some way of defeating the dragon. His hand brushed against what felt like a sword hilt, and the room was suddenly lit by a dull greenish glow. Huma jerked his hand away in surprise. He had hoped, he had prayed. Now, at last, he had found the very thing. Only he feared to touch it, for some reason, as if something instinctively warned him not to. Grasp me, use me, wield me. I will be your will come to life. The words rang clear in his mind, clear, sweet, seductive words. They came from within the sword itself. That, I think, is a suitable cliffhanger to leave you until next time. So, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. And I know that there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to be afraid of, and there's a lot to be worried about. But reach out to people that you trust. Make connections, make plans, make preparations. You're stronger than you realize. Do your best. I'm already proud of you. Just do the best you can do. Okay? So take good care of yourself. Just take good care of yourself.